Hello, I am Zara, the black child my grandparents wished never existed, the twin who was abandoned by her mother. Yet in this adversity, I found strength, resilience, and love. It all started when I was born. My sister, Lily, and I were born on a chilly winter morning. We were twins, but unlike most, we looked nothing alike. Lily was born white, taking after our mother with delicate features, a cascade of curls, and eyes as blue as the sky. I, on the other hand, was born with dark skin, inheriting our father's African roots. I was a mirror image of him with thick, coiled hair, round dark eyes, and a sturdy frame. Despite our differences, our mother was overwhelmed with love for both of us. Our mother, Emma, a beautiful and kind-hearted woman with milky white skin and shimmering blonde hair, was deeply in love with our father, Jamal, a tall, handsome man with ebony skin and a gentle soul. Emma's parents were traditional, narrow-minded people who could never fathom their daughter loving a black man. But love is stubborn, and so was Emma. She had hoped that the birth of us, her children, would bridge the chasm of prejudice that lay between our families. How wrong she was. Emma, my grandfather's voice echoed through the sterile hospital room as he held Lily, cooing and complimenting her fair skin and vibrant blue eyes. I, on the other hand, was a mere spectator in my crib, untouched and unnoticed. My grandmother, with her stern features and cold eyes, eyed me with an unmistakable air of contempt. This, my grandfather gestured towards Lily, is our granddaughter. A true embodiment of our lineage. His voice softened, a stark contrast to when his gaze landed on me. As for this one, he looked at me with a sneer. We have nothing to do with her. His words were like a dagger through Emma's heart. But she's your granddaughter too, my mother interjected, her voice shaking, her eyes welling up with tears. Emma, she is not like us, my grandmother added, her words laced with disdain. Look at her, she's black, not a drop of our blood is evident in her. My father, who had remained silent until then, finally stepped forward. Every child, he said firmly, is a gift from God, irrespective of their color. You should be ashamed of yourselves. I don't understand why you can't love them equally. They're both your granddaughters. Emma's voice was choked with emotion, her hope crumbling, her heart shattering. With that, the room fell silent, the air dense with unspoken words and stifling prejudice. In that silence, my fate was sealed, and the path to my challenging future was laid. Our first birthday arrived with a tense atmosphere rather than joyful celebration. Lily and I were a year old. While I was starting to grow into my features, my sister had already captured the hearts of our relatives with her porcelain-like complexion and delicate curls. It was as if we were two halves of a broken whole, one accepted, one shunned. The grand party my grandparents had organized was for Lily and me, but it soon became evident that I was nothing more than an unwanted guest in my own party. All the guests were white, and they all belonged to my mother's side of the family. My father's family had been invited, but they were met with cold glares and harsh words. Emma, Grandpa's voice boomed through the party. He gestured at my father's family. Why have these people come? This party is for our granddaughter. His voice was sharp, and his eyes darted towards me dismissively. They are my family, Dad. They're here for their granddaughter's birthday. They have every right to be here. My mother's voice was strained, and she was trying hard to keep her cool. Indeed, my father chimed in, trying to maintain the peace. We are here for our daughters, both of them. Look at them, Emma, my grandmother said, her voice thick with distaste. Do they look like they belong here? They stick out like a sore thumb. My father's face hardened. He was hurt, I could tell. The only thing sticking out here is your prejudice, not my family, he retorted. The tension between the two families grew. Whispers and murmurs filled the room. My father's family felt out of place, unwanted. My mother was trapped in her own party, torn between her love for my father and the pressure from her family. You do realize, Emma, my grandmother's voice was acidic, this is a birthday party for your daughters. But look around. Your friends, your family, everyone is uncomfortable. And why? Because of them. Her gaze was directed at my father and his family. Enough. Emma finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. You're ruining their birthday. Both of them. Can't you just put your prejudice aside for one day? It's not just about today, Emma. Look at that child. She's a constant reminder of your mistake, my grandfather said, pointing at me with distaste. She's not our granddaughter. She's their granddaughter. We have nothing to do with her. His words echoed in the room, harsh and clear. That night, my mother cried herself to sleep. She was stuck in a place where her love for her children and her man was seen as a mistake. And me? I was the symbol of that mistake. That's when my journey of being the outcast in my own family began. The following months after the birthday party were turbulent. The visible favoritism shown towards Lily, my mother's continued struggle, and the growing resentment towards me all created a storm of conflict within our family. One night, I fell severely ill. My small body was racked with fever and chills. My mother, in her conflict of emotions, hesitated to seek medical attention. But fate intervened. "Emma," my father's panicked voice echoed through the silent house. He'd come for a surprise visit, only to find me burning up with fever. Why hasn't she been taken to the hospital? Caught in her own web of deceit and guilt, Emma stammered, "Hi, I didn't realize she seemed fine earlier." "Because of what, Emma?" My father's voice was stern, demanding an answer she couldn't provide. Their tense exchange occurred in hushed tones, but the undercurrents of their strained relationship surfaced that night. The confrontation culminated with my father's ultimatum, hanging heavy in the air as he turned away from Emma. That night marked a shift in their relationship. Emma, my mother, the woman who bore me, seemed to drift further away from me. As for my father, he found himself in a juggling act between his love for Emma and his desire to protect us, his daughters. This was just the beginning of the numerous sacrifices he'd make. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure of societal expectations and family ridicule was slowly gnawing at my mother's sanity. She made a desperate decision, one that would change the course of our lives forever. This part of my past was later revealed by my father, filled with disbelief and betrayal. "I'm thinking we should go on a picnic," Emma announced one day, trying to infuse a note of cheerfulness into her voice. Just the three of us, a little escape from everything. On the day of the picnic, Emma packed us into the car and drove off. We ended up in a city far from home, a place where no one knew us. She stopped in front of a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, took me in her arms, and placed me on the porch. There was a quick kiss on my forehead, a fleeting moment of regret in her eyes, and then she was gone. Returning to our city, Emma quickly put her deceptive plan into action. She set up a makeshift tent near a lake, dialed the police, and, in a panic-stricken voice, reported a horrifying story. "A crocodile. It took my baby. I couldn't do anything." The news of my alleged death shook the family. The police, my father, and the rest of the family rushed to the scene. My father was stricken with disbelief, but amidst his grief, suspicion began to brew. "Emma," he confronted her, "something is not right. Crocodiles aren't native to this lake." "I don't know, Jamal," Emma retorted, her voice trembling with fox distress. "I didn't invite the beast. It just appeared and took Zara." Despite his suspicions, the story was consistent, and the police had no other leads. The shared grief was overwhelming, and in the midst of it all, the uncomfortable truth was ignored, buried under a pile of well-crafted lies. Thus, the family mourned the loss of a child, believing a story spun by a desperate mother. Yet, there was one who continued to harbor doubts and held on to hope, my father. In the days following my supposed death, a suffocating silence settled over the house. The atmosphere was heavy with a strange mixture of grief, relief, and a hint of unspeakable satisfaction. Emma bore the mask of a grieving mother, though underneath that facade was a turmoil of guilt and relief. Lily, though too young to understand the permanence of death, sensed the sudden void that my absence created. But it was the reactions of my grandparents that was most telling. Grandpa, a man usually stoic in his demeanor, wore a peculiar expression. His words of mourning rang hollow, bereft of the sorrow that should accompany the loss of a grandchild. "I can't believe she's gone," he would say, his voice conspicuously devoid of genuine grief. Similarly, Grandma, who had always been more expressive, became oddly silent. Her stony face barely betrayed any emotions, and her eyes, usually so full of life, were unsettlingly quiet. Yet, in her silence and Grandpa's hollow words, there existed an almost palpable sense of relief. In whispered conversations and subtle glances exchanged, the undercurrent of satisfaction over my supposed demise became increasingly evident. Their deep-seated prejudice, which they had so far veiled under feigned affection, began to seep out, tainting the air with its ugliness. As days turned into weeks, I was remembered less and less. My existence, once so vibrantly black and defiant in the sea of their whiteness, slowly faded into the background. I became a distant memory, my life reduced to a handful of hushed conversations and mournful sighs. Yet, Amidst this charade of grief and veiled relief, one person's sorrow was real: my father. His grief was palpable, his loss profound. He mourned not just the daughter he thought he had lost, but also the family that was falling apart in the wake of his loss. On a chilly morning in another city, a white couple named Martha and George found a bundle outside their home. They were a kind and loving pair who had been praying for a child for years. The sight of a little black girl in a makeshift cradle on their doorstep filled them with a mixture of shock, joy, and a tinge of worry. George knelt down and picked up the note attached to the blanket. His eyes grew wide as he read, then turned to his wife, a strange look in his eyes. "It seems we've been sent an angel, Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Martha bent down to the cradle, pulling back the blanket to reveal me, peacefully sleeping. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of joy. In her heart, she knew this was an answer to their prayers. "But George, what will people say?" Martha asked, her joy overshadowed by the practical implications of adopting a child who clearly didn't share their skin color. "We'll figure it out, love," George reassured her. "What matters is that she's ours now." Martha and George were determined to do right by me. They went through all the legal processes to officially adopt me, making me a legitimate part of their family. During these proceedings, they never once showed any hesitation or regret about their decision. The day my adoption became official was a quiet celebration in our small home. There were no grand parties or fanfare, but it was filled with immense joy and warmth. It was the day they officially named me Hope, a name that reflected the renewed joy I brought into their lives. "We chose the name Hope for you, my dear," Martha explained to me once when I was old enough to understand, "because you are a ray of hope in a life that seemed barren." Adjusting to my new family was never a problem. Martha and George showered me with all the love and care a child could ever ask for. They never made me feel different or out of place despite the stark contrast in our skin colors. I grew up seeing myself as just Hope, their beloved daughter, rather than the black child who was abandoned by her own mother. Despite the immense love and acceptance, I often found myself questioning my origins. I would sit for hours staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to piece together my past. I was always aware that I was adopted, that I was different, but it didn't bother me until I started school. Children can be brutally honest and naive. They asked questions, pointed fingers, and occasionally laughed. Their remarks stung, but I learned to cope. I'd rush home to Martha, who'd envelop me in her arms and assure me that being different was not bad. "Remember, Hope," George would tell me. "You are our daughter, and we love you. That's all that matters." And that's how I grew up, surrounded by unconditional love and acceptance, yet silently yearning to know more about my past. Back in my birthplace, my biological parents were going through their individual struggles. My mother, burdened with guilt and remorse, was a shell of her former self. I imagine she must have played our last moments together over and over again in her head. The guilt of abandoning her own child gnawed at her from within, manifesting in various psychological issues that started to plague her. At gatherings, her once vibrant laughter turned into quiet smiles. Her eyes, which used to sparkle with life, now held a vacant look. Friends and relatives noticed the change but assumed it was due to her grief over losing a child. If only they knew the real story. She was fighting internal battles every day. No matter how much she tried to justify her actions to herself, the guilt and regret were too overpowering. She yearned for redemption but was too deep in her web of lies and deception. My father, on the other hand, was living in the hope that I was still alive somewhere. The official story never sat well with him, and his paternal instincts told him that his child was out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. But he didn't have a clue about where to start, and he lacked any evidence to disprove my mother's story. Their lies had diverged since my disappearance. My father spent his days in hopeful anticipation, while my mother drowned in her guilt. Yet, they both had something in common: they were living their lives around the void left by my absence. As my twin sister grew older under the care of our mother and grandparents, a seed of bitterness was planted within her. At the heart of it all was our father, the man my grandparents had deemed responsible for their supposed misery. Despite his attempts to bridge the gap, my sister's heart was hardened by the whispers she'd overhear, the snide remarks from friends and relatives, and the veiled prejudice that ran deep within our family. I can only imagine the conversations that transpired within those walls. "Your father's a good man," our grandmother would tell my sister, her voice filled with an unspeakable sorrow. "But you shouldn't have forced his life choices onto us. Look at all the pain it has caused." My sister, too young to fully comprehend, would nod silently, her heart slowly absorbing the silent prejudice that laced those words. My father, unaware of this gradual change, continued his attempts to win over his remaining child. He'd visit her regularly, bearing gifts and warm smiles, only to be met with cold indifference. I got you a new doll, he'd say, trying to mask the desperation in his voice. I thought you might like it. My sister would accept the gift, her little fingers wrapping around the doll. But there was always a distant look in her eyes, a wall my father could not break through. I wish you'd come to visit me someday, he would say before leaving, a plea hanging in his voice. But his words would fall on deaf ears as my sister retreated into her shell, further away from our father and closer to the narrative our grandparents were weaving. Unbeknownst to him, every visit, every gift, every plea only added fuel to the growing fire of resentment in my sister's heart. I often wonder if things would have been different had we grown up together. But then, I wouldn't have the life I came to love. In stark contrast to my sister's growing resentment, my life was filled with love and warmth. My adoptive parents, Martha and George, provided a home I could feel safe in, a family I could rely on. They showered me with unconditional love, something I would eternally be grateful for. But being a black child in a white family was not without its struggles. As I, Hope, grew older, my difference became more prominent. The inquisitive stares, the hushed whispers, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, indications that I didn't quite belong. It was an inescapable reality I had to navigate each day. Despite these challenges, my adoptive parents were my rock. They taught me the importance of understanding and acceptance, of love that transcends the barriers of color. Their unwavering support gave me the strength to face my daily battles. But within the corners of my heart, a longing persisted, a desire to know my biological parents. I yearned to understand my roots, to uncover the truth about my past. Martha, do you ever wonder about her real parents? I once overheard George ask, his voice heavy with concern. Of course I do, Martha replied, her voice echoing the same worry. But it's her journey to make, George. We can only be there to support her when she's ready. I cherished my life with Martha and George, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being out of place. A sense of not truly belonging persisted, a constant reminder of the family I never got to know. Despite the love and acceptance I felt in my home, I found myself perpetually torn between my present and the mysteries of my past. Life has a funny way of dishing out surprises when you least expect them. I was on the brink of a momentous occasion, my graduation. My biological mother, a woman I had never known, was also on the precipice of a significant event, her impending death. But fate was about to link our trajectories in a profound way. Guilt and regret plagued my birth mother, Emma, as the sand in her hourglass began to run low. Haunted by the sins of her past and the specter of her inevitable demise, she resolved to unburden herself of the dark secret she had concealed for so long. The guilt of abandoning her own child was a weight too heavy to carry into the next life. I need to tell him. I need to confess, she whispered to herself, her voice tremulous and frail. With the solemn determination of someone with nothing to lose, she called my biological father, who lived a world away. He had been oblivious to her deed, their lives having taken separate paths. Her shaky hands dialed his number, and she made a strange request. I have something to confess, and I want you to record it. Then post it on the internet. It's important. Taken aback, but acquiescing to her odd request, he video called her. He watched through the screen from miles away as Emma's frail form appeared. Her face was etched with lines of remorse and impending doom. I abandoned our daughter, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper but brimming with regret. His face mirrored shock and horror, but Emma continued, explaining the fabricated picnic, the abandonment in a remote city, and the intricate lie about a crocodile attack. It was a tale spun from guilt and fear, her desperation palpable even through the screen. And, I hope, she finished, her voice barely audible, her breath shallow. I hoped she found a better life. Her confession echoed in the digital void, punctuated by the silence of my father, who was too stunned to speak. He did as he was instructed and posted the video on the internet. It was a Hail Mary attempt to reach out to me, a desperate wish that those who found me might see it and facilitate our reunion. It was an unwitting prelude to a series of events that would lead me, the abandoned child, on a path towards discovery and truth. Life as I knew it took a drastic turn on one sunny afternoon. I was home from college, taking a much-needed break. My best friend, Lily, was visiting me. We were lounging in my room, both of us engrossed in our phones. Suddenly, Lily's face lost its color as she stared at her screen. "Hope, you need to see this," she said, handing me her phone. Her voice was thick with concern and a hint of dread. I took the phone from her and watched the video she had paused on. A woman, frail and tear-stained, was confessing something. As I hit play, her words crashed into me like a tsunami. She was talking about a child, a baby she had abandoned years ago. My heart pounded in my chest as her story unraveled. The woman was confessing to leaving her baby in a distant city, fabricating a tale of a crocodile attack to cover her tracks. As the video concluded, I realized to my shock and horror that the child she was talking about was me. I don't remember dropping the phone or Lily rushing to comfort me. I was in a state of shock, my world spinning. I was that abandoned child left by her own mother. The woman on the screen, Emma, was my biological mother. As the shock receded, it gave way to a rush of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, and confusion swirled within me. I needed to confront my adoptive parents, George and Martha. I needed answers. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. They looked up from their evening tea, surprised by my tone. As I replayed the video for them, their expressions changed from surprise to guilt. They confessed everything about finding me, the decision to adopt me, and the unspoken truth about my origins. The revelation rocked my world, setting me on a path of self-discovery. I felt betrayed and hurt, but there was a part of me that also felt relief. Finally, I had an answer to the question that had haunted me for years. Where did I come from? The confrontation with George and Martha was tough. I was torn between my feelings of love for them and the sting of their betrayal. But through it all, I knew one thing: I had a past that I needed to confront. The seed of curiosity had been planted. It didn't take me long to decide to meet my biological family. The curiosity was too potent to resist. Within a week, I found myself standing outside a suburban home in a town I'd never visited before. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked on the door. The woman who answered the door was frail and looked gravely ill. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me. "Hope," she whispered, reaching out to touch me. I pulled back, anger flaring in my chest. "No," I said, my voice sharp. "You don't get to do that. You lost that right when you left me." She crumbled at my words, sinking to the ground in tears. I felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly squashed it. She didn't deserve it. Next, I met my twin sister. It was a surreal experience to look at someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to me, but was a complete stranger. She was beautiful, with fair skin and soft features. Yet her eyes held a coldness that mirrored the grandparents I'd never met. When I extended my hand, she looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. The rejection stung, but I was not surprised. I'd learned that she held a deep-seated prejudice fed by years of influence from our grandparents. The meeting with the grandparents was the most bizarre of them all. They refused to believe my identity, insisting that their granddaughter had been taken by a crocodile years ago. Their denial was so firm that it seemed they genuinely believed their own delusion. Finally, I met my father. He was a tall man with dark skin that mirrored my own. His eyes were warm and filled with tears as he looked at me. "My baby girl," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I've missed you." Despite my anger and hurt, I couldn't resist the pull towards him. He was the only one who hadn't rejected me. As I fell into his arms, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't expected. Despite the emotional whirlwind, I knew one thing for certain. I belonged with my adoptive parents, Martha and George, the ones who had picked me up when I was left alone, who had loved me unconditionally. I needed to go back to them. After an intense emotional exchange, I turned my back on the mother, sister, and grandparents who had rejected me. As I walked away, I felt my father's hand on mine, providing a comforting presence in the maelstrom of emotions. The reunion was not what I'd hoped for, but it was something I needed. I'd faced my past, and now it was time to return to my present. A DNA test seemed redundant at this point. The woman who abandoned me was sure the house matched Martha and George's description, and my biological father's acknowledgement was undeniable. Still, for formality and closure, I decided to conduct a DNA analysis. The results only confirmed what I already knew. One night, over a quiet dinner, I broached the subject with Martha and George. "I'm thinking of changing my name," I started, unsure of how they'd react. They looked at me, surprise evident in their faces. "To what?" Martha asked, her voice filled with concern. "Zara," I responded. That was the name my biological father had given me when I was born. It was a part of my identity that I wanted to claim back. Martha and George were silent for a moment before George reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "If that's what you want, then we support you," he said, his voice firm. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Not long after that, I received news of my biological mother's death. I was surprised by my own reaction, a mix of sadness and relief. I didn't grieve for her as a daughter would for her mother, but rather as a stranger grieving for another's suffering. I attended the funeral, standing at the back, observing as the woman who had given birth to me was mourned by others. My sister and grandparents were there, tears streaming down their faces. It was a stark contrast to the stoicism I felt. I saw my father too, his figure slumped with grief. After the service, he approached me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "She loved you in her own twisted way," he said softly. "I know," I replied, not knowing if it was the truth or just something we both needed to believe. As I walked away from the gravesite, I felt a sense of closure. I was ready to move on, ready to start a new chapter in my life. My biological father was a part of it now, but the rest was all me. Zara, the woman who had been abandoned as a child, adopted by two loving parents, found her way back to her roots and chose her own path. I looked forward to what lay ahead, aware of the challenges but also aware of my own resilience. In the end, I was just a girl named Hope who chose to become Zara.